Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, our listeners. This is the Non-Existent Story. We are live. Myself, Hannah, my sister, Casey, presenting this week's episode of the Non-Existent Story. This week, Casey will be presenting her two stories. One, of course, is real, that an author has published it. It does exist in print. And the other has come from her head, and we infer it was going to be of a similar style to the one that already exists, but she may do something tricky and try to confuse us. And it is our job, after she presents these two stories, to pick which one is hers and which one belongs to the author that already exists. Although they may have been dead for some time. We never can be sure. Usually they are. So, Casey, take it away.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction and for representing, as you know, the spokesperson you kind of are for the public at large.
You're welcome.
Their spokeswoman. Mm. Well, one thing I do want to add before we get into the content is that we are now officially available on iTunes.
Are we getting money for that, by the way?
No, it's free. It's free, which I personally think that art should be a gift. And which is why I'm a little concerned. Apparently, we have to be very careful about what kind of music we play, and it needs to be free and have no copyright restrictions. So the music selections this week will come from the Free Music Archive.
Very good.
They should be good to go, I believe. But yeah, so we're available on iTunes and Stitcher. The Non-Existent Story. We're the only ones called that. We come up pretty quick on Google too, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So let me give a little context. The generic title for this week's episode is American Thomas Bernhard. Do you know who Thomas Bernhard is?
No.
That's great. So Thomas Bernhard is was one
dead.
of the he is dead. So you guessed that right already.
I'm so good at this game.
You are getting better. We need more guests. So Thomas Bernhard was an Austrian writer. He wrote in German. He's probably one of the most influential writers to come out of Europe after World War II. He has a very distinctive style. They're usually kind of long rants or monologues as well, in which this was showcased quite well. So it lends itself well to being read out loud, and also there's a certain musicality to it because he actually was a professionally trained musician. So basically the Thomas Bernhard style, it's quite distinctive. Usually it's a hysterical overreaction to a seemingly, but only seemingly benign or innocuous practice or institution, which he kind of dismantles very logically, kind of rigorously, but also with a certain rhythm that may or may not be indebted to his musical training. So basically they're long rants against Austria. That was what he wrote. Rants against Austria and Austrians. So one of the things that's really interesting about trying to adapt him is to think, well, would this particular style and this particular set of themes work in other contexts? And these stories that I'm going to present, both situate Thomas Bernhard or Thomas Bernhard-esque style and set of concerns in an American context. One of them does exist and is an American writer. And by I'm using America as broadly as in North and South America, as I tend to.
So it might be
American,
Canadian. Or
Canadian, it could be Ecuador, it could be Argentina, it could be the United States, it could be any number of American, continentally speaking countries.
I'm going to go with Canadian. Yes, I think I understand. Distinctive hysteria, especially against Australians. Austrians.
Austrian Thomas Bernhard would also be interesting, but entirely different. Mm. So without further preamble, let us begin.
Yes, let's.
Story 1. I met Vega in a bar one afternoon. It was the first time I had seen him in nearly 20 years. We were friends in high school, or we knew each other anyway, but he had left the country as soon as he graduated, and I hadn't seen or heard from him since. It appeared, however, that though I had barely remembered his name, I was the closest thing he had to a friend in his native country. I had stayed in the city. I'm a journalist, but shortly before Vega's return, I had decided that I wanted to write fiction. Vega, meanwhile, had spent the last 18 years in voluntary exile in Canada.
Ah!
He made a You're so right, so soon.
So good.
He'd spent the last 18 years in voluntary exile in Canada. He made a comfortable living as an art history professor at a prestigious university, and he had a Canadian passport, his prized possession. He had come back to attend his mother's funeral. It was the only thing that could have brought him back. During the nightmarish 2 weeks in his native country, he passed the hot afternoons hiding from his brother, whom he hated, and his brother's family, whom he abhorred, in a small bar on the fringes of the city. The country made him nervous and anxious. He had to talk to someone about it, and I was at hand, so he talked to me. And then the rest of the entire story is and all of the entire story really, is one long monologue that takes place in this bar. And I will be reading it accompanied by Laszlo Arsenyi's As the Night Ends, available at the Free Music Archive. I love coming here at the end of the afternoon, sitting here in the patio, drinking a couple of whiskeys in peace, listening to the music that I asked the bartender to turn on for me, Vega told me. Not sitting at the bar there inside. It's very hot at the bar. It's very hot inside. It's better here in the patio, with the drink and the jazz that the bartender plays for me. This is the only place in this country where I feel okay, the only decent place. All the other bars are vile and abominable, full of men who drink to the point of obliteration. I can't understand it, Moya. I can't understand how these people drink this disgusting beer so eagerly, Vega told me. It's a filthy beer, a beer for animals that only gives you diarrhea. That is what people drink here, and the worst thing is that they are proud of drinking it. They are capable of killing you if you tell them that what they are drinking is filth, dirty water, and not beer at all. No other country in the world would consider this beer, Moya. You know it as well as I do. It's a disgusting liquid, and it can only be drink this filth with pride. Any pride. No, with national pride. With the pride that they are drinking the best beer in the world, because this is the first and foremost characteristic of ignorant societies. They consider their shit is the best in the world. They are capable of killing you if you deny that their shit, their poisonous, nauseating beer, is the best beer in the world. I haven't been back for 18 years. And during those 18 years, I didn't miss any of this, not for a moment, because I left precisely to flee from this country. It always seemed to me the most cruel and inhumane joke that, with all the other countries there are on the planet, it was my lot to be born here. I can never accept that out of the hundreds of countries there are in the world, I was fated to be born in the worst of them all, in the most stupid, in the most criminal. I could never accept it, Moya. That's why I went to Montreal, and long before the war. I didn't leave this country as an exile or to seek better economic conditions. I left because I could never accept my macabre fate of having been born in this country, Vega told me. Understand how it could have occurred to you to stay here in this country. It is truly absurd if what you're interested in is writing literature. It shows that, in fact, you have no interest in writing literature. No one interested in writing literature could choose a country as degenerate as this one, a country where no one reads literature, a country in which the few people who are able to read would never read a literary book. They even shut down the language departments in the universities. That gives you some idea, Moya. Here, no one is interested in literature. That's why they shut down the departments, because there are no students of literature. All the young people want to study business administration. That's what interests them, not literature. Everyone wants to study business administration in this country. In reality, in a few years, there will be no one but business administrators. You live in a country that will soon be... Stop. That will soon be populated entirely by business administrators. That is the truth, Vega told me. The horrible truth.
Sounds like a nightmare.
A country entirely populated by business administrators. Yes. All right, so that is the end of story one. In both stories, the excerpt is really what matters. The summary is really more of a setting or a pretext for staging a long monologue. They're quite theatrical in that way. As long as 300 pages.
Oh my God.
So Are you ready for the next one? Any
Yes.
questions?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. Well, not yet. At the end, I will have questions.
We will continue with the American Thomas Bernhard theme. Okay. So the summary, or rather setting, for story 2. Again in first person. When I was 10, it fell to my mother to care for my dying grandfather. Not knowing how long she would be away, and afraid that I would miss too much school if I accompanied her, she sent me to stay with a cousin of my father's, whom I had never met, who was not on good terms with anyone in the family, but who lived conveniently close to the school and did not dislike children. The woman's last name was Adams. I have no idea what her first name was, and I would still guess her age as anywhere between 25 and 50. I remember that she asked me during our first meeting what I thought about the marriage and the family units. Most important thing. If I knew what kind of trees grow in front of my house, I said tall ones. And who was my favorite English poet from the early modern period? I said nothing. And then she had me write a description of what I had done that day. She informed me that I was a functional illiterate, but that was probably an advantage in this country. It made me a more desirable employee. Over the next few months, we would have long conversations after school in which she would tell me about literature and philosophy and music. She was a professional violinist, and warned me against the perils of the church, the state, the public education system, the private education system, weddings, the theater, and all art museums without exception. So here's the excerpt, and this excerpt will be accompanied by Karen Gomio's rendition of Bach's Partita No. 3 in E major on the violin, also available at the Free Music Archive. You are short, said Adams. Go fetch the Oxford English Dictionary and place it on your chair, and then sit on top of it, and that way we can see eye to eye across the table. But before you sit down, turn up the volume of the music. It will help muffle the sound of the perpetual construction in the street. In the center, it is always noisy, because it is always under construction. It is never good enough, the center of our discontent. That's a line from Shakespeare, said Adams. You don't recognize it, do you? All the better, really. No author has been more thoroughly besmirched and defiled than Shakespeare. Not long ago, while I was listening to the news, I heard an advertisement for the so-called American dream car. Quote, we are the stuff dreams are made on, unquote. That is also a line from Shakespeare, and quite a good one. The news is the only production in which the commercials are preferable to the so-called content. There is nothing worse than the news. It is like an eternal train wreck, ghastly and revolting, and yet we cannot keep ourselves from slowing down to stare at it, to gape at it. Every morning, day after day, year after year, we stare at this train wreck that is the news, this base and mendacious litany of human depravity interspersed with Shakespearean car commercials. Though really, continued Adams, there could be no more fitting destiny for Shakespeare than car commercials. That is, of course, what would happen to the greatest writer in the English language, because English is the worst language, the lowest point in the history of the evolution of languages. No other Western language has so many words of a single syllable, and that is why English is the perfect language for advertising. It may have a vast vocabulary. You're sitting on it right now, in fact, but that is not why English is the lingua franca. English is the lingua franca despite its vocabulary. The rich English vocabulary was an obstacle that had to be overcome so that it could attain the great honor of becoming the language of car commercials, said Adams. And this cannot fail to astonish us when we reflect that the purpose of any advertisement is to captivate people's fantasies and play on their desire for luxuries. And nevertheless, it is impossible to imagine a less sensual or luxurious language than English. In the great family of languages, English is the spinster aunt whose only hobby is attending church and undertaking perversely unnecessary knitting projects. English is a dry, spinsterly language. This is the truth. And this truth is amply demonstrated anytime any one of the so-called great writers of the English language is translated into another, superior language. Edgar Allan Poe is more terrifying in French. His prose, I mean. Of his unbearably infantile sing-song poetry, the less said the better. Milton's Pandemonium only attains truly epic proportions in Italian. Faulkner's decaying southern is more southern and more decadent in Spanish, and every other English writer is better, much better in German, or at least they sound as if their words might possibly have some sort of substance and consequence, admittedly a grim consequence, but even that is better than the English language's unflagging iambic pentameter imperative to buy or pay or eat or grope or play or kill or fuck or brunch, or worse, do brunch. Now that is a truly terrifying proposition, to do brunch. Never consort with anyone who does his meals instead of eating them, especially when those meals that he does are not proper meals at all. It is extraordinary how English has, in a few brief centuries, managed to reduce the whole range of human activity to this gray, leaden, menacing do, said Adams. And just as the English-speaking peoples of the world sally forth to do Paris, or do Rome, or do the islands of the South Pacific, so too do they do brunch and those other absurdly named meals, in which they pause from their tedious, monosyllabic activities to take some nourishment, so that they might continue to do other, equally tedious, monosyllabic activities, because to act in English is always tedious and monosyllabic, like so many raps on the knuckles, or barks of a foreman, or the beats on the galley slave drum. End of fragment 2.
I love both of these inordinately. I don't know where to start.
You will like Thomas Bernhard.
I'm sure after this that I would. I would like to do. It would be wrong of me to say to do Bernhard.
Do some Bernhard.
As to do brunch, I think it has a different inference here. Okay. So as there's little, well, there's no really plot so as much as build-ups to scenes so that they can monologue. I can dispense with trying to summarize any plots and focus on the juicy bits, which are, as you said, monologues. That's in the differences between the two. Although both are very excellent and can stand on their own as hilarious. So I'll focus first on the first one you presented, which was set in a bar. An exchange, we infer a very one-sided exchange between two people, which I was initially interested in because it was set up where this man who had lived in Canada is talking to this other man who is a journalist, assuming a sense of camaraderie because they are of the same country. And that is all he really needs.
Same country, and they went to school together.
Yes, and they went to high school together. Although, I don't know. I can see why this man would not have any other friends and would need to rely on some. So
the Thomas Bernhard narrator is always rather solitary and select in the people that he or she chooses to consort with.
Yes, they would have to be, wouldn't they? So they delight in being more debonair or cultured or insightful than everybody else, and then are big to point out how everybody else is less insightful and cultured than they are anyway.
Well, I don't know. It's maybe that's kind of what comes across more in the American versions. They're usually just against everything. And they have very strong opinions, and they're the only ones that have these opinions. So, and they're against ignorance, but usually the objects of attack are not just like some poor dude who's like cleaning the floor or something. It's usually an institution or people who consider themselves to be cultured or the upper class. So that's why you get, in the first case, you get the attack on the business administrators and this sort of this petty bourgeois mentality, and then in the second one, you just get a more general attack on English, which is kind of the business language that you have to learn in other countries, and kind of the educated person's language. So.
Right, and a bit of a tie between the two, because in the second it's an attack on the English language, and then in the first it's attack, at least towards the end, on the business administrators, which, as we know, are intrinsically tied with the English language. At least, yes, at least that's my understanding of how it works.
And true, anyway. This is, I think, what makes them so American, both of them, because in Thomas Bernhard, you're more likely to find an attack on German or particular manifestations of it.
And also, and you said this again with how adamant their opinions are, and they are the only ones who have these very adamant opinions. And I've noticed this in a lot of fiction where it's a group of intellectuals getting together to talk, is they're so very adamant and extreme in what they say, in this very offhanded kind of way. So I do associate those kinds of statements with someone who is an intellectual, because I feel they're the only ones who could say something so stupid and get away with it.
Well, so something so stupid or something so sweepingly general. And I think one of the interesting things about Bernhard, and you have to kind of get longer sections or where he talks about particular philosophers or something like that, is that he's actually quite rigorous in his like dismantling of those things. Like his attack has a logic. There's definitely a logic to it. It's not just like although it just kind of manifests itself at that. But I think what they're kind of resisting is this idea that you can objectively criticize something. It's very subjective. It's hysterical. There's this like emotional overworking, like they're about to have a panic attack, which I think is meant to be, as opposed to like a professor at a university in many cases, or any kind of expert who's always calm and cool-headed and reasonable. They're quite hysterical, but if you see the logic of what they're saying, you find that it's actually more convincing than so-called scientists. So-called is a big thing with Thomas Bernhard.
But I think that's why I so loved both monologues, is because they're very intelligent. They're these intellectual people. There's no negating the fact that they are very smart and very exposed to a great deal of the world, but they get so hysterical and caught up, and they say these crazy things, but in such a kind of cleverly, neurotically articulate way that you'd love getting caught up into it, even though you couldn't disagree more in some instances with what they're saying. It's kind of a pleasure to listen to at the same time. So I did love that. And then I also, well, I already said how that the business administrator, I certainly can relate to that as going to school as an English major, and seeing all the money in the institute going towards the engineers and the business administration departments. as you see before your eyes the what are they called, the liberal arts shrinking.
Yes, I think our generation has been privileged to that in very massive ways, although it's not exclusive to this particular American country. But and that's one of the things that makes Bernhard, I think, difficult to adapt to the Americas, because we've always been, and speaking, I think, especially in the United States, we're an industry country, and we really value invention and work and productivity and things like that. And art has always been kind of a secondary thing, whereas in European countries, art has a lot of power and is associated with a high level of prestige and influence. So Bernhard is much more likely to attack certain artists or certain artistic institutions than we would in the U.S., where they're always on the defensive.
Because they have to be.
Yes. Which is one reason that we don't have a major avant-garde movement the way like Italy or France or Spain did, or for that matter Latin America. It's because art wasn't as powerful. But and Bernhard is the thing, but and the aristocracy too, which we don't have in the same way. So it's quite tricky to adapt. And I think that in both cases that you have to pick an institution and then just rail at it like hysterically with all your arsenal for as many hundreds of times as is necessary until you collapse.
And I don't know how much fun that is to execute, but it's certainly delightful to watch, at least in this instance. Which brings me to the second story, and I think that my favorite part, although I loved a lot of different parts of the second one, was that this woman railing against the English language and delighting in her own disdain for the language, which we assume she is doing in English, is directed towards this small boy. I picture sitting silently on a chair at the dining room table on top of an encyclopedia, mouth a little ajar, just kind of looking around as she's going on to this crescendo of radio violence. I thought that image was pretty magnificent.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that I did as well. I think that one of the cool things with Bernhard is that it's never or almost never just a narrator speaking directly to a reader, which you could easily do. You could just be like, I think this, and then just go off. It always has to be a reported speech of some kind, or almost always. But the vessel of this reported speech has to do absolutely nothing.
Right,
just
and
record it. So a child works quite well, I think, for that, especially Thomas Bernhard had a very terrible childhood, and he's kind of like a great defender of certain things about childhood, but except for his autobiography, in the books that I've read by him anyway, children aren't particularly present because it is such a rarefied hyper-intellectual, privileged environment in which his characters are generally operating.
It is, and it makes I did like that other side to both of the monologues as well. So in the first, you become the journalist sitting across the table in passive kind of absorption of this man's tirade. So that is who you become. And then, but in the second one, there's a filter, because you're not becoming, it didn't feel as though you're becoming the person who's listening. They're kind of buffering it for you, and then you're filtering it in. So it seems to come to you as though through a child, and you kind of feel like a child because you're kind of associating yourself automatically to this little boy sitting on this encyclopedia as his relative goes off, or at least that's the position I took when I was listening. Which I thought was kind of cool. Very, very well. I don't know. It seemed subtle, but it was cool. I like that aspect of it. But
well, I'm glad. I think it keeps it from being too depersonalized or cruel. It always has to be situated. He's like, and that's the thing again with the adaptations, is that because most of Thomas Bernhard's oeuvre or collected works is about how much how horrible Austria is in every way. Like, to put it in a different context, you need that, but then it gives it a sense of rootedness. So it has to take place in I had to kind of take away some of the country qualifiers because I just thought that it would be better, basically, and more difficult or something. I'm not sure why, but you have to do that. And then I think the other thing that you have to realize, or that I find really interesting about how seriously or how literally one should take these rants. Like, you don't have to agree or disagree or take seriously necessarily all of them, but at the same time, there's a certain validity into what they say. And the thing with him, I think it's like an aesthetics of exaggeration. I think he wrote somewhere that Thomas Bernhard, who's not the author of either of these stories, that if you don't exaggerate, no one will understand you. So to get your point across, you have to just inflate it out of all proportion and just repeat and insist over and over again until it kind of gets conveyed. And it's much more interesting to read than like a kind of a
dissertation.
Yeah, anything academic that's ever been written, basically.
No, I thought it was ingenious. I love these a great deal. And I'm trying to think of anything else that I want to ask about them before I try to guess which one you wrote. And
well, what do you think are? And this is not a question that I have an answer to, but like, that is driving these monologues, because there's a tremendous amount of release of energy. So like, what is your sense of where this energy is coming from?
Well, my impression is that give me a moment. That's an interesting question. I don't know how old either of these characters are meant to be. The woman is anywhere between the ages of 25 and 50, and the man is some manner of professor in a Canadian university. So I'm thinking at least a little bit older. But the tone that I take of anybody who's strongly objecting to something that they say nevertheless is, no matter what they do about it, is that they cannot abide change, and all change is negative, is terrifying, is bad.
So you see it as a kind of a reactionary, conservative, traditionalist impulse.
I do, although the way that they approach it, I don't see it as a reaction indicating that they're trying to change the status quo so much as avoid and criticize it. There's no active attempt to change or alter what they perceive as is, and that's what makes them so. That's what makes them so delightful, is because there's no sense of hope or aspiration or ambition. It's all just kind of relishing their own disdain and superiority over something.
Well, yeah, I don't know if they relish a superiority. I think maybe in the first one, because he's in Canada and he has this passport, and so he's kind of escaped. There's a sense of that, but yeah, perhaps they're. I don't know if they're. Maybe it doesn't come through as much, but I think there's usually a kind of vulnerability in the characters too, and that's why they're so upset, because they're kind of affected by this, and so that's why they react so strongly. But I mean, I don't know that I would call it necessarily resistant to change. I think that they see certain eternal tendencies or national tendencies in particular to be
national. Yes, definitely. I mean, for the woman critiquing how Shakespeare's English is turned into car commercials, and then
that's pretty rare.
That's contrasting that with how much better certain languages are when illustrated in other languages, as if to show, well, I'm familiar with German and with French and with Poe and with these other people, and they're so much better in the languages that they don't write in, and it's.
Well, again, I think you have to take it in context too. So it wouldn't be as. It only works when the object being criticized is dominant and in power. So language is the dominant language, and you do have to know it. If someone railed on Swahili, like, that would just be kind of a dick move. You know what I mean? Like, you pick things that people revere and value and seem to be the most dominant and powerful, and you go against those. So nationalism, or linguistic hegemony of English, or the requirement to watch the news, or what else does he talk about in the first one that I read? Or, that you have to have a practical career. Like, these are things that are considered normal. So if they went on these rants against things that are considered exceptional or fragile or not dominant, I think that they could maybe come across as more arrogant. But they're attacking the dominant influences. At least that's how I see it. Or at least.
No, I understand. I see your point, but I don't know that I necessarily agree, because it's easy, as you said, to diminish something, as you said, a dick move, but certainly something that you could do. So, and maybe if you worked hard enough at it, you would distinguish it. But it's like, I don't know. I got a sense that they relished going up against something that, for the very fact that it was so established, and that they knew there was nothing they could do about it, is what made it such a pleasure. Because then they were firmly associated with the, I don't know, the non-powerful but morally or intellectually superior, which makes them the elite in that sense. And
there's certainly an elitism to it. I think that's probably why it is elitist, for sure. But I think that it's an elite kind of on the margin, and usually it kind of spirals into a certain self-destruction. It's not a constructive impulse of, let's replace this with something better. It's a protest that ultimately kind of exhausts itself. It burns itself up, which you can morally judge for and against either, I suppose. But I think often the better art is the self-annihilating protest has a certain nobility to it.
Oh, I do agree. I think again that's why it has that energy that makes it so entertaining, because it's ultimately going to lead nowhere, but there's a kind of pleasure in that.
Yes, no, there's definitely a hedonism for sure to it. Like, and the characters, at least in Bernhard, and they're quite European in this way, but they tend to be very particular about clothes and wines, and have quite exacting tastes about everything, and it's so extreme and over the top that it becomes hilarious and almost a parody of itself in a way, but also extremely individualistic, which makes it endearing, and why he's so copied, because there's no one, I mean, it's a very recognizable style, and no one is able to do it for as long or as well. I could read you like an excerpt of like a real Thomas Bernhard, just a really, really short one, so you get a sense of how good it can be. But I'll say
No, I
that
do
later.
believe you. I do believe you. And I would like to hear it later. But I am now, I think, going to guess which one of these you wrote now that we've discussed it. There's another avenue that I would be interested in discussing, but maybe not at this juncture.
Okay.
That specifically being how the business administration part makes me think of our brother. But
Well, they're always, oh, just to add, like, so the family, the total failure of the family institute, or the family institute, the institution of the family is like an ongoing trope in almost every Bernhard thing. They're extremely destructive, perverse, abusive, cruel families in which the children are kind of like all hate each other, and more or less rightly so. So many of the novels are just rants against his family. That's actually just
of which there's no win to that argument. So I think that's why he relishes it so much.
Yeah,
It's never going to. It's not like something that you will destroy. But that's the pleasure in it, I suppose. So,
Indeed.
which of these do I think that you wrote, and which do I think that you didn't write? Although I don't know how you found so accurate an imitation of the Bernhardt style that you could then in turn imitate.
I know, right? It's an imitation of an imitation.
I
It's a
know.
simulacrum.
And I could try to overanalyze this and think, well, you probably deliberately put X or Y here to make me think you wrote it. But I'm trying not to fall into that trap. I'm just gonna go with my initial instinct. Although
because I definitely fell into that trap last time.
it has led me wrong before, but I think I'm gonna stick to it. I think, and again, this is because of reasons that I've already pointed out, that I said that I think I've noticed in your style that there are elements of the instructive in a lot of the dialogue, especially. So I already know that you know that I know that. But even so, I'm still going to go with the guess.
Oh, you froze. No, I don't know what you said. You shan't give it away.
Am I back?
You're back. You're back.
Okay.
With that was a pregnant pause.
Oh my God. Where did I stop? Tell me.
With the ... It sounded like it could have been on purpose. You were buying more time. I know your wily ways. Your wily Google Hangout ways.
Although both were extremely clever and very similar in style, if not identical. I will say, because of the instructive tone that the female relative takes with her young temporary ward in the second story, and because I know that I've that tone in your writing before between dialogue with characters, I'm going to say you wrote the second story.
I did write the second one, so good job. I think they're both instructive, though.
Yeah, but the tone is different. I can't tell you how they're different, but I can.
You can tell. You've captured on it. Well, it's funny because in in Thomas Bernhard's last novel, and this is actually a theme in a lot of his stuff, is that there's like they're professors, and there's like a tutor relationship. So there's always an element of the didactic, and partly because there's this need to compensate for the total failure of the education system and these more personal individualized, spontaneous encounters. But yes, so I did write the second one. The first one, so I'm still down by 2, which is annoying, and probably soon going to be expensive.
Well, we've got some time until December, so I wouldn't worry too much.
That's true, but we'll be going to a less frequent recording schedule. Yeah. So the first one, and I was very excited to find this because I've admired Thomas Bernhard for at least 3 relationships, which in my case is, as a serial monogamist, is quite a long time. He's the one man in my life who's been there, for 8 years or so now. This is his name is Horacio Castellanos Moya. He is actually from Nicaragua, but this story is set. The first one is set in El Salvador.
Okay. That's part of
so Thomas Bernhard in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. It's called El Asco, which is like disgust, and then it has this kind of arresting image of a glove on top of a broom handle that looks so obscene. But yes, basically, so that part that I read is from like the first few pages of what Castellanos Moya took on as an exercise in writing like Thomas Bernhard. So it's on the cover and everything. That was meant. But it's interesting because it was so what he took from Thomas Bernhard, Thomas Bernhard is always talking about or frequently about aristocratic families with castles and estates and high art, and they're usually art critics and things like that. So things which have no place really in El Salvador. But he made it work because what he captured was the violently anti-national sentiment.
Okay.
And so that's what Castellanos Moya thought was most adaptable or moldable, or whatever the word would be, malleable in Thomas Bernhard. So it's a long rant against El Salvador, and he actually he had to flee the country after he published it because people got really, really pissed.
Was it the finger maybe on the?
No, it wasn't even the. I mean, because the cover, I'm sure has changed, but no, I mean, it goes about like the national foods and the national beers and like the national this and that, and people really, especially in smaller countries, can be quite nationalist because it's that's just how it is in smaller countries frequently. And so he had to, like, there were death threats, and the government got really upset with him, and he had to leave. So it did have real repercussions. I don't think that Thomas Bernhard was ever forced to leave Austria, to my knowledge. And then the second one, I would imagine would be in North America somewhere, although it would kind of work in South America too if it was like an English tutor or something.
I pictured it in Pennsylvania in the fall for some reason.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I was actually in
New England. That's funny. And then I decided,
maybe like Philadelphia of the 50s in the fall, something like that.
Yes, 50s
around the same time of Death of a Salesman. I would picture this.
Okay. Yeah, it would have to. I would say like mid to late 20th century. Because if you start talking too much about language, then you have to kind of mention other media if it's more contemporary, and someone has to take out their cell phone. So to avoid the cell phone, which is always better.
Yes, and Facebook as well.
Yes. So those are the stories.
And I will say we were talking about both, at least with the first one, with the part about the aristocracy and the sense of nationalism. I'm reading a lot of D.H. Lawrence lately. I don't have the type of relationship with him that you have with your author. Unfortunately, we've not been together for 8 years, but it's been a couple now. And I had fallen in love with him previously when he wrote, I think it was called Death of Chrysanthemums, which is a short story, and now I'm reading Lady Chatterley's Lover, and I'm only in the beginnings, but it's got a lot of recent one kind of tension between the classes, the upper class, and the minor. Just as good.
Hold on, you froze there for a second. So you said so yeah, that was a banned book actually. I've never read it, or I don't think I've read it. But if I did, I forgot about it, which is probably not a good sign.
I have a good sign for it. So far, I really liking it. But it does deal with kind of a class warfare of that time. Not that it's a war exactly, but tension, and then combined with the horrors of recently post World War I, and then gearing up towards World War II, and all of the horrors that are associated with that. He wrote while he was dying of tuberculosis.
Lady Chatterley's Lover, he wrote while he was dying?
Oh. He published it like 2 years before he died, in his mid-40s.
Okay. So it spans the teens and the 20s and the 30s and goes into the 40s?
Doesn't go into the 40s. He died in 1930.
Okay. So it's like post World War I.
Right. It's during, and most of the story focuses on after, but almost exclusively in very tawdry ways, dealing with the wounds the country has been afflicted with because of one, and it's often never pushed to front, but it's like this kind of massive background presence that never goes away.
Interesting.
It's pretty cool. But it made me because of the class warfare aspect of it. It made me definitely think about these stories, particularly the first one. I thought was relatable. But yes.
Yeah. No. The class thing is interesting in Bernhard. I was convinced because his stories that I read are so consistently about the upper classes that he came from an aristocratic family, but he didn't. He came from an extremely poor family. So it's kind of like Salinger and the Glass family. If you've read like Franny and Zooey or Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters or any of the other ones where he kind of talks about this genius family, and I always found it like totally convincing, and it sounded autobiographical, but it isn't. However, yeah, Thomas Bernhard is actually from an extremely humble background, and like went hungry for long periods and grew up in post-war Germany and things like that.
And no, I think that because so was the case with D.H. Lawrence. All of his characters are these upper class intellectuals, and he was the son of a miner.
Interesting.
Yes, and was very poor. And so I think that maybe that's a trend where you have these authors who have these insights because of coming up in these very poor families, and they perhaps more than most of their relatives value in education and lead you, and then they try to they get good at blending, but also maybe about trying to make a point that they come from a different world, but also a point about being able to blend with the other intellectuals that they aspire to be more like.
For sure. It's like kind of like, well, it makes me think a little bit of Gatsby actually too, which is about this issue as well and contemporary. Yeah. But I read somewhere, and I'm trying to remember who wrote it. It might have been Bolaño, who's like a Chilean author who's quite good. But that great writers are either come from the aristocracy or from the extremely poor classes, never from the middle class.
Damn.
So I don't know if we're doomed or not, but I think there's something about being an educated, ambitious person of humble origins that allows you to kind of intermingle with upper classes, but also see them as an outsider. It kind of lends itself well to certain kinds of.
Right. It's good because you then you feel excluded from both worlds, because you never really fit in with the people you aspire to spend all of your time with, and you're never really accepted by the people that you were born into because you've made all of these efforts to distance yourself from them.
Exactly.
So that sense of not having a connection, being an outsider no matter where you go, I think is perhaps what makes writers good. That come from those
it would be hard for me to think. I mean, there are some that have lots of friends and things like that, but most really good writers I think kind of have to be on the margins, because that's where you observe. So yeah, I think that there's usually a sense of not fitting in or being a misfit, and that's I think why also like the choice of attacking patriotism or rampant nationalism in one's country is such a frequent and such a well appropriate theme, because you kind of have to know the country, but you have to be on the outside of it. Because if I just attack Ireland or something, like it won't be as good because I don't know about it. You have to be like, you have to kind of be on the outside and on the inside at the same time to do a really good
an emotional connection that's very deep, but also a deep disdain of it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you've heard it here first, listener.
So now you know the secret.
How to attack a country. It should be one that you live in, but then you should leave for a little while.
Yeah,
and then come back.
State.
Oh wait, you went out. What'd you say?
I said, or a state as well, to be a nifty little spot. States work equally as well for this, I think, especially
states
the poor ones.
Yes, the poor ones, or the states where they have a lot of state pride, like Massachusetts or Texas or California.
All the great writers live in Massachusetts and Vermont, don't they? I mean,
so the way, like, at least I understand, and I'm not real strong on American literature, but there have been different centers, like intellectual centers in the U.S. because it's such an enormous country and has so many cities. But New England was big first, and then it kind of moved to the South, and for a while, like, the South was really important. And then Chicago has had like really golden moments, and then there's, you know, a whole LA, California. So it kind of rotates, I think. Yeah, New York definitely is kind of perennial. But then they kind of, like, New York is definitely, I think, a place that would be the one that I would pick, actually.
I think so.
It's this.
Nowhere can you feel so miserable. You have such extremes, I think. You are frozen, so am I too?
And enough about it. That?
No, what? I didn't hear anything you said in the last 20 seconds.
Maybe this is a sign that we have to quit while we're ahead before this becomes
I think so. Well, tell me first what you would call your story before we go, because I'm very bad at asking that.
Oh, yeah, you know, I didn't, because I just finished it today. This was a struggle. This was a difficult birth, this one. I spent a lot of time on it, and it was agonizing, and I made myself write yesterday. And then I mostly made it somewhat coherent today. But what would I call it? I'm not entirely sure. I might, perhaps the Oxford English Dictionary.
I like that.
But I'll leave that for now unless I come up with
or the Shakespeare car commercial.
Yes, which is a thing that I did actually hear the other day. The all-American car. I wear the stuff that dreams are made on. I was like, I don't think that it was that dream that they're talking about.
They made it on the Midsummer's Night in the back of another car.
Maybe, which would be a different Shakespeare.
A different dream.
All right, well, yeah, so we'll leave on the Shakespeare note. I'll be seeing a rock opera version of Macbeth on Monday, so I'll let you know how that is next time.
Yes, definitely do. That sounds cool. I will be drinking more wine.
That sounds great. I will probably be doing that shortly too. Well, we'll sign off on that so that our listeners think that our life is one endless song and dance of literature and wine.
Oh, it is.
We'll talk about our actual All right. Au revoir.
Goodbye.